in the war in Ukraine. The first thing was the big announcement on Friday that the Pentagon intends to send cluster munitions to Ukraine. Now, this is very controversial because cluster munitions have been banned by quite a few countries. There was what was it? It was like a treaty that was signed. The United States did not sign this, neither did Russia, to ban cluster munitions. Tell us first of all, what are cluster munitions? Why are they controversial? And what is the significance of the U.S. wanting to send these over to Ukraine?
We're talking about bomblets. They look about the size of a baseball, and you may have inside one munition 50 to 100 of these, and they are supposed to explode on contact with whatever they strike after they break out of the warhead that fires them from an artillery system. Actually speaking, to understand why we're doing what we're doing, you really need to keep in mind two things. First is desperation. We've largely run out of any more 155 millimeter high explosive ammunition to send. We don't have it, neither do most of our allies. We've got backlogs that will take months to fill these requirements. The DPCIM, in other words, these bomblets are available, so we're sending them. Number two, they're not that effective. They're really designed for soft targets. In other words, they're designed principally to maim or harm human beings, destroy tents, destroy light structures, trucks, Humvees. They were devised after Vietnam as a means of dealing with large numbers of people spread over an area in jungle terrain. We weren't able to get to them with precision munitions because we didn't have that much precision then. So the bomblets were useful. Today, we have precision with virtually every munition that gives you accuracy for point detonation. So you really don't need the bomblets per se. And frankly, in 1991, our experience with them was very mixed. They were actually more trouble to us than they were worth, because after we in armored formations moved through them, where there were many, many duds, they had no impact on us. They couldn't hurt us in an armored fighting vehicle, but they did enormous damage to the wheeled traffic that followed us. And so we continually asked people, don't use this anymore. And then after the war, of course, we treated numerous children and people, just residents of towns and villages that had accidentally stumbled on these things or picked up one of these thinking that it was something you could toss. It exploded and did damage. So there are a lot of good reasons why countries have said, no, stop using this. And right now, the United Kingdom and Germany, I know, have both said, we don't want any part of this. And I happen to agree with them.
So it's almost like laying a minefield in a way. I mean, once these bombs drop and they scatter, and how many did you say are inside?
Well, let's see you have 150 of these that land in a particular area. And of that number, you may have anywhere from 20 to 30 that never explode. They just don't detonate. And so they present a permanent hazard until someone identifies them and destroys them. So in that sense, they're worse than a mine, because mines, you find minefields, you can mark a minefield, you can avoid a minefield, and then you have equipment to deal with it. We don't see these bomblets until we're driving through them or over them.
So there's no way to clean it up. Once you've done it, you can't go back and try to figure out, okay, where did these go? Because we don't want children running into these fields and playing with them.
Well, I'm sure that you probably can if you calculate effectively, but the problem is it's a war zone. And no one is going to go out there with a big bag and say, I'm collecting these things.
So what would be the advantage then of Ukraine using these? I mean, besides the fact, is it really that we just don't have anything else to give them and this is all we have left? Or is it that these are advantageous to them in some way?
I don't think they'll be of any great advantage to the Ukrainians. Again, it's this desperation. Washington is desperate, London is desperate, and the people in Kyiv are desperate. Ukraine has lost this war. They've taken anywhere from 300,000 to 350,000 dead. These are dead Ukrainian soldiers. How many hundreds of thousands of wounded there are is anybody's guess. The point is that they're running out of equipment, running out of ammunition, and running out of manpower.
Why do you think this war is taking so long? I think many of us in the very beginning of this war back in February of 2022 thought this is just going to be several weeks. And then it's going to be over. And yet here we are a year and a half later and it's still going. What do you think the reason is for that?
I think there are two reasons. First of all, most of us thought that the Russians would go into Ukraine with a vengeance. that they would effectively destroy Ukrainian units in their barracks. They would pulverize anything they ran into, and they would try to rush through whatever lines they encountered to come to terms or close combat with the Ukrainians. The opposite was the case. Putin gave very strict guidance that there was to be little or no collateral damage. You were not supposed to shoot anyone unless you could identify them as a Ukrainian soldier. And he actually wanted to give as many Ukrainian soldiers as possible the opportunity to surrender. Well, the Ukrainians turned out to be very formidable. There were almost 400,000 of them that we had equipped and trained. And they decided to pull into towns and cities and effectively fortify themselves. This caused their ultimate annihilation because once you sit in a fortified place, you could be surrounded, isolated, starved, whatever, and eventually destroyed. So it didn't work, but it was something the Russians were not prepared for. They also decided when they couldn't find anyone who would negotiate. Some of your listeners will remember that in late March, Ukrainian President Zelensky said that, well, I think we could probably live with neutrality, which was one of the key demands of the Russians. They just wanted a neutral state on their border, not a member of NATO. They didn't want to see U.S. missiles show up in eastern Ukraine that could threaten their own nuclear deterrent. Well, ultimately that failed because Boris Johnson flew in from London with instructions from Biden to make sure no agreement was reached. Mm-hmm. So suddenly the Russians are standing and saying, well, this is going to drag on now. We only have about 220,000 men in our army. We have about 134,000 draftees. This isn't going to work. So they went over to the defensive. They tried to occupy all the territory that was essentially Russian in terms of population, which they've done. But then they said, we can't continue this. We need more forces. So they went on to the defensive. They conducted this as an economy of force mission and let the Ukrainians essentially smash themselves to bits trying to defeat the Russian defenses. That's why it's taken so long.
Yeah, and the counteroffensive right now with Ukraine is not going well. In fact, Zelensky even said, he admitted this on Wednesday when he was talking to the BBC. He said that the counteroffensive is slower than desired. And he said some people believe this is a Hollywood movie and expect results, but it's not. So they're not going very well. From their perspective, from the Ukrainian perspective, how much longer, I mean, even with these cluster munitions, how much longer can they go? What would they need? I mean, are we talking like the next step is nukes?
No, I hope not. And I don't think there's any evidence that the Russians would launch any nuclear weapons, or for that matter, I don't see any evidence that we will. We both understand the consequences. There's no such thing as a small nuke. You know, you explode a tactical nuclear weapon, 5 kilotons or less, everybody's supposed to stand around and say, oh, well, don't worry about that. That's a small nuke. No, what happens is that everybody says, we better use what we have before we lose it, and you get Armageddon. I don't see that happening. So, no, that's not the answer. The second thing is Ukrainians, as I said, are running out of ammunition, people, equipment. They're losing everything that we send to them faster than they can employ it effectively. And you can't build an army on the fly. You have to have an organization in place, an institution. Those things never existed. So the Ukrainians at this point will continue to try and demonstrate that there's life left in them. But the truth is, if the Russians attack, they'll be swept away. And they know that. They will die in a hail of incredible artillery fire, rocket fire, missile fire, and they'll be overrun by hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. So the question is, what happens in Vilnius at this meeting? Are we finally going to come to terms with reality? Will we negotiate an end to this, or do we force the Russians to do what they really don't want to do, which is attack? I mean, they'd like to end this war without a terrible bloodbath beyond what already exists.
Okay, but you know the military-industrial complex, the hawks, the warmongers, they've been saying there is no way we can let Russia win. And first of all, you know, what is Russia winning? So could they maybe spare themselves by spinning it and saying, okay, Russia can keep the land that they've already basically taken at this point, and this somehow they can, is there a way to spin that as a loss for Russia so that we can get out of this? Because I don't know how we're going to get out of this when they've been saying this whole time, Russia cannot win. We must ensure they lose.
Look, there are two realities here. One is that the European populations, even the Polish population, is opposed to direct war with Russia. So there's no appetite to go in there with large numbers of U.S. or European forces. Now, the Poles and Lithuanians are talking about trying to do something independent of NATO. That won't work. The Russians will regard that as a NATO threat, and they will be destroyed. So I hope someone with a clear head puts an end to that nonsense. The second thing to keep in mind is most Americans don't care. They're not even watching. They've got their minds focused on all sorts of domestic problems. So the notion that if the president were to announce the Ukrainians have given all they can, it is time to end this tragedy. There is no point in any further loss of life. I think most Americans would say, well, that's great. They don't care. It's the people in Washington that don't want to admit that they were wrong. All of their assumptions from the beginning were wrong. The goal of destroying Russia and forcing Putin out of office was ridiculous. It was silly. And we're now out of ammunition. And we don't have the forces to send in there. The Russians have 300,000 troops in reserve ready to attack. We have nothing like that.
But doesn't it make us look bad? I mean, here we are saying, flexing our muscles, saying we're the mightiest military in the world. And now if Russia ends up ultimately winning, I mean, what does that say for us?
It's a little late. We look ridiculous as it is, in my judgment. I mean, if you go walk the streets of Berlin a year ago, people were saying, oh, well, this is terrible what the Russians have done. Now on the streets of Berlin, people are saying, what, are the Poles insane? Are the Americans insane? We don't want a major war in Europe, and we don't need it. And remember that before this began, Russia had a very small army. Now it has an army of at least 750,000 with brand new weapons ready to strike. I mean, the Russians have practically mobilized the country. We're nowhere near that. It would take us months to catch up. It's time to be realistic. They have more in this game than we do. What happens in Ukraine is existential for them. For us, it's like Cuba or Mexico. But for them, it's everything. For us, Ukraine is nothing. We want the best for the people. That's about it. Or that's what we should want.
Right. And peace, definitely ending this war and peace would be the best thing for the Ukrainian people. Is Lindsey Graham an idiot? And I ask this because... Well, here's the thing. So he has tweeted out saying, I will be working with Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to pass a resolution urging the admission of Ukraine into NATO. The best way to prevent future wars and promote peace is to create security guarantees that make aggressor nations think twice before starting wars. Ukrainian NATO membership is vital to the future security of Europe and the world. I believe there's an overwhelming majority of senators supporting this proposition, he says. But he's now facing rebuke from Republicans in the House and the Senate because they're saying, no, this isn't actually what we want. Why is Lindsey Graham so out of step with the rest of the Republicans? Is he just more bought off by the military-industrial complex than the rest, or what's the deal here?
I think you always need to identify the donors. There are major donors out there, oligarchs in the Western sense, billionaires, Zuckerberg, Gates. There are many, many others beyond that. Look at the hedge fund managers that are billionaires. Where does their money go? What do they want? We have a ruling class that hates Russia, that wants to destroy it, then wants to strip it of its resources and exploit it for profit. That's what it's about. He's simply saying what his donors want him to say. Now, he's a combat lawyer, remember? So he understands everything there is about warfare. He's been under fire many times. He knows what it is like to watch American soldiers die or be wounded in foreign lands, doesn't he? No, he doesn't. The second part is that the rest of the world right now looks upon us as the aggressor. Most of the world sees what Russia is doing and doesn't see it in those terms. If Russia were the aggressor, things would have been different right now in Ukraine. That place would look like a parking lot, and the Russians would be well on their way to the Polish border. That hasn't happened, and that's not what the Russians want. The Russians, especially Mr. Putin, wants to be able to live with his neighbors when the war ends. We don't seem to care about that. So what we've left behind us is a trail of hatred and destruction in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya. That's not what Putin is interested in doing in Europe. So that's why the whole notion of, well, if we don't stop the Russians now, they'll go straight through. That's a lot of nonsense. This is 2023, not 1903. not 1983. The world really is different. We need to look at it through a different lens.
Yeah. One other thing I think why Lindsey Graham is kind of an idiot in pushing for this is that it would be in the Republicans' best interest if this war ended under Biden, right? I mean, we saw what happened with the withdrawal of Afghanistan. That was a disaster for Biden. It was done in a very disastrous way. Many of us, I mean, I definitely wanted to see the end of that war for sure, but didn't like the way it was handled. This would be a gift to Republicans if this ended under Biden. And it was like, look at Biden. He's failed us completely. Rather than rolling this into the next administration, which very well would be a Republican administration, many of us believe, and then having to have the Republican end it, and then look who Russia wins. I mean, it just seems like you'd want to back down now as a Republicans. You would think would want this. But my question is, you've been in the military for a long time. You were on the battlefield. How does the United States move forward with this military, the military-industrial complex? How should we re-envision? Because we're not winning. We can't even beat the Taliban, a bunch of people in the, random fighters in mountains. We're not winning wars. We haven't won wars in so long. And now here we are, another mistake. What is the future for the military for the United States?
Our military is at a low ebb. We spend more money than anyone else in the world. In fact, more money than the top 10 powers in the world on defense. We believe that if you shove enough money into the Defense Department, you're going to get competence, capability, military power out of it. That's not true. Can we have 44 four-star generals on active duty? 44 generals and admirals, 4 stars. We have 1.12 million people under arms. In 1943, we had 12.2 million under arms. We only had 7 4 stars, generals and admirals. One wonders how we possibly won the Second World War with only 7 4 stars. Aren't we lucky that we have 44 today? What's my point? My point is this is a bloated bureaucracy. The numbers of people who actually deploy and fight are minimal. And now we have destroyed morale. We're undermining discipline with all of this wokeism and nonsense. The military has been turned into a social experiment. It's designed to make people in Washington happy, and they think it's making their constituents happy. Oh, look at my daughter, Susie. She's a warrior. It's a lot of nonsense. We're living in a fantasy world. The Russians would go right through us. Let's wake up. They're serious. We're not. So what has to happen? We've got to go after this military establishment. It needs to be reduced. And then we need to come to terms with another reality. The defense industries are businesses. It's in their interest to make as much money as possible. Who's watching it? Nobody. Nobody's questioning anything because people on the Hill are pocketing a lot of cash by going along with bad programs and bad policies. So the whole military establishment needs to be reduced. You've got to get it back down to a lean fighting machine. Then you can begin really reforming it, reorganizing it, and changing the way we command and control it, the way we recruit for it. That's going to take us years. It will take us 5 to 10 years to recover, I would say, from the last 20 years, and certainly from the last 2.5.
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely many of us want to see a reduction in all of this, but I don't know how we're gonna do that since it is business and people are out there making money and they've got jobs and billions of dollars in the pocket.
Nassim Taleb tells us that we're staring financial Armageddon in the face.
Yeah.
I would listen to Nassim Taleb and what he says. I would listen to James Ricards. These are people who are warning us about printing money and raising interest rates. They're warning us about the use of monetary policy to fix structural problems in the economy. Can't be done. Something's got to give. And we haven't even talked about the border. We haven't talked about the rule of law, the criminality in our cities. What are we doing in Ukraine? There's nothing there for us to do. Everything that we need to do is here at home. And most of the world is eminently capable of defending itself. And contrary to popular belief, there are not large armies, navies, and air forces in China and Russia just waiting for the opportunity to invade somebody else. Nothing could be further from the truth.
I want to wrap up now by talking about Prigozhin? What in the world is going on with this? So we saw a mutiny, a supposed mutiny that lasted a day or less than a day. We did see airmen killed, maybe about a dozen of Russian airmen. Nobody was arrested for that. There didn't seem to be any repercussion for those lives lost. Prigozhin then was supposedly exiled into Belarus. Lukashenko made a deal and brought him over to Belarus, supposedly. But now we're hearing reports that he actually met with Putin 5 days after this supposed mutiny, and he's now apparently roaming free in Russia. I mean, they're saying that he's been spotted in Moscow, he's been spotted in St. Petersburg, that he's just, Lukashenko said he's not in the territory of Belarus, so he's even said he's not here, and he's been spotted all over Russia. So what in the world, what happened and what is going on? Was this just a ruse? Was this real? Because now I'm starting to think the whole thing was a plot to maybe root out treasonous generals on the Russian side.
Well, I think Prigozhin is a natural reality TV star. And I'm sure someone in Hollywood has got his number and will find a way to bring him over so he can have his own reality TV show. The man's very entertaining, but he's not stupid. And the second part is that some of it was real, but a lot of it was not what we thought it was. And there is some evidence that it may have been staged, but I can't tell you that because I don't have access to the kind of intelligence that would substantiate it. What we know is it was not an uprising. We know it was not a coup. Nobody joined Prigozhin. Nobody. People saw what Prigozhin was doing, and people had heard him before. And what did he say? We're not fighting this war the right way. That's his criticism. These generals at the top are slow, old men, grandpas. They don't want to come to terms with what's out there. Let's go crush these Ukrainians. That made him enormously popular in Russia. And he said he wanted to get to Vladimir Putin and explain to him he's got to change things or we will drag this war out longer than we want to. So what did he do? His forces were not in contact with the enemy. They were in reserve. He went down to Rostov, the theater headquarters. He had a discussion there with one of the deputy commanding generals. Then he said, well, send 3,000-4,000 guys to Moscow, and then I'll go up there and talk to Putin and see